I'm going to introduce our speaker, who's also going to read for us from her upcoming book, Truth on Water. Bobbi Rathert is a native of Northeast Iowa. She was a psychotherapist for 25 years on the north side of Chicago and more recently part-time in La Crosse. Bobbi also raised meat sheep for 18 years at a farm in Vernon County, and in retirement moved to La Crosse and became involved with Hope Restores. Bobbi's forthcoming book, The Truth on Water, will be available by the end of the year and launched at Pearl Street Books. Welcome, Bobbi Rathert.
Thank you. Thank you. I think I might stand over here because they have new carts at Walmart and I feel like they're this high, and sometimes I feel that way with podiums. But today, how much time do I have here? I've been conscious of that. Pardon me? Oh, all right. I didn't want to spend a lot of time talking about what is Paddling for Hope and what is Hope Restores. But maybe during the discussion, if you have questions or if you're not acquainted with those two things, you can speak with Eileen. She was on the committee for Paddling for Hope, and you can speak with Shai, who is the director, one of the directors of Hope Restores, and she was, of course, instrumental for Paddling for Hope. So I don't want to really go into that, but I'm hoping also most people here have heard those things in town for the last year or two. I am the paddler for Paddling for Hope, and I started up at the headwaters last year and got as far as Dubuque, Iowa. And for me, that was the river. I had enough, and I had a very full experience, and I've written it into a book that I started last year, and I just finished, I'm going to say last night. I'm really happy to be done. But in the book, I've written about the spiritual part for me, being on the water, being alone. And I've written about the bugs and the birds in the water, and not a lot about people. Partly because there weren't a lot of people that I encountered. But today I wanted to read short portions that had to do with people or corporations and how those things affected other people. So I'm going to abbreviate maybe by paraphrasing some of it and also reading some of it. Alyssa also asked me to consider the principles that you use as a guiding light, and I did that, but I found that the readings I have align with almost all of them each time. I'm sure you guys already know this and run into that, but so much of what I felt on the river was about the spirit of people, even though I didn't see people, or the equity amongst us, or the lack of it, about how one group treats another and doesn't even notice it. I ran into that a lot on the river. So my book talks a lot about that, and the first thing I wanted to read about was the day I was paddling downriver, and which was common to just open up onto something unexpected. And I opened up onto a strip of, I wasn't sure if they were buildings or businesses, but they were small, not very fancy. And in front of each one was a large sign in protest to the Enbridge pipeline, which just was right under the river as I passed over it. And I didn't expect it, I didn't understand it, but since I've grown to understand more about it. So I wanted to read this section out of a chapter I entitled My Book. And that is not about the book I wrote, but a book I carried, which you and I share. And it's the book I carried with me through the whole trip. So I wrote a chapter about the book, and this is in it. As I kayaked quietly on the water that day, my thoughts and concern about homogeneous river populations did not leave me. They came up naturally and occasionally, and then stayed at length other times. People groups have historically clashed and continually struggled with each other. Despite their serene appearances, the communities along the Mississippi were no different. One location in particular was where Enbridge's Line 3 pipeline crossed under the river, carrying tar sands oil to US refineries. The next paragraph, I'll just paraphrase a little bit, because a lot of people wonder why that even matters. It just goes under the river, it goes under the soil. Why would we care? But there are big reasons and tiny reasons. One is when you're camping up there, you can hear it when your ear is to the ground. I mean, disruptions are everywhere of all sizes. You can see it, the forests are torn through with big alleys and big pumping stations installed. But I think in the people part, the corporations in charge of this will say they did ask permission to put this through these sacred lands of the Ojibwe people. But they don't really ask. I think we all know that too. They tell in a question. And these pipelines were going to go through no matter what. So they've gone under these sacred lands that we've promised to these people as their own, and also as their gathering places for food and products for sustenance. And in particular up there, there's the wild rice fields that grow in the lakes that get very thick to where you can't really even paddle through, but you have to grab hold of the rice plants and pull yourself across. And the harvest is about taking those reeds and shaking them into your kayak or canoe and filling it up with the rice grains. These are very sensitive wild plants that react to changes in water. And even though Enbridge said nothing bad will happen, last November, 400,000 gallons of radioactive water seeped out into these rice lakes. And I'm sure they knew this would happen, because it does happen. But to get all the commotion calmed down so they can push these pipes through under this sacred land that we promised to someone else, they ignored the truth. And I titled my book, The Truth on Water, because I feel what I've written about is the truth. But sometimes I think I should have written it as my truth on water. So it kind of overlaps, and it may differ from your truth, but I think we all agree that that is an egregious error of disrespect and even brutality against a large group of people that we see every day, even here in La Crosse. But the differences in people and how we can't come together was so clear, even in the wilderness. My next paragraph about that includes the disruption of the rookeries, the crane rookeries, and how the cranes are so sacred to the indigenous populations, and they've had to rise up and find new homes. But as I traveled through, I saw large and bright colored protest signs, even after the pipeline was completed and pumping hundreds of thousands of barrels daily under this quiet, natural, sacred place. The infraction is unforgivable because nobody's apologized or agreed that a crime against humans and nature has even occurred. No one is too guilty to be forgiven if they only hold themselves accountable. So hearts remain heavy still, and no one is paying attention anymore. After this water leaked out, it's full of tritium, which is an isotope of hydrogen, and it's radioactive for longer than we can even imagine. But Xcel Energy said it's only infected their groundwater, and they'll have it cleaned up in a year. So again, this is about truth and untruth, and power and the disempowered. And even in the wilderness, it's everywhere. And that was stunning to me, and it was a surprise. The next thing is from my chapter called Signs. And I had gotten lost a lot. Many times I called the Coast Guard once, and I called the sheriff, and I pushed my SOS a couple times. But there was so much flooding that the riverbanks were obliterated, so I couldn't find the river sometimes. And so I was mad about no signs. Turn left, turn right. So I wrote a chapter about signs and how there was one sign on the bottom of a John boat someone tipped up and spray painted, Mississippi River that way. And I appreciated that. So I wrote about that, but this is a different kind of sign that came up around the same time. And I was paddling for hours in this beautiful, quiet wilderness, and the river, I'm not sure how many people have been up there, but it's narrow. It's not like what we know here. I'm thinking that the widest up there might have not even been as wide as this room. So it was very lovely. And when something would pop up, which it did, that was human-made, I got startled because I didn't expect it, and it's not on the maps. And this was one of those things. And it was a building right on the edge of the river, but it was raised up. It was a raised up river bank. And it was a concrete square building with no windows, no sign saying who owned it, what it was there for, and a little parking pad next to it. So I figured, well, this isn't supposed to be here then, you know, if it's just so, we're supposed to pretend it's not there. But it frightened me anyway. So I moved over to the other side of the river, and I went very slow, and near it was a sign facing this way, like that we'd have to do this to read it. There's a very large sign, so this is about that sign. When I got closer, I saw a large sign facing the river, almost shouting a warning like this, because it was all capital letters. Sudden underwater discharge, dangerous, turbulent, stay back. And I'm sure they were talking to me, because, you know, there were no other boats on a small river like that, and who else would need to stay back? But I wondered what that was under the water and why it would be so sudden and so dangerous and mysterious. The narrowness of the river made me question where to stay back. So I slowed my speed and weighed my options. Mechanicals and technology inside the building must initiate the sudden forceful discharge when no human can predict it. But a person did paint the warning sign using a broad brush and black paint on a white-colored rectangular board. So it looked like somebody did it, not the company who owned the building, but somebody decided they needed to do this. There could be cooling waters, I imagined, from a nuclear plant or city runoff through its drainage system. Even though I was a lone paddler, innocent enough, the technology and pipework could not know or even care that I was passing just outside. 100 feet were between me and where I should be to avoid the pandemonium from sudden forceful turbulence in the river below me. An image flashed of me on my kayak, balanced dangerously on a whale's airstream rising high over its blowhole. I backed up, I set my paddle, and I raced like a squirrel crossing a road. And I did that a lot. I was startled quite a bit and afraid of things that I didn't understand because I never knew if there was a danger or if it was just there. And it was a stationary object. And this one, I'm thankful for the signer, we wouldn't know. There was no other indication. So safely outside the discharge area, as I crossed its invisible boundary, I slowed to continue my path down the river, feeling glad that there was no whale. Another channel converged with mine, not far downstream, and near it was a second hand-painted sign. Again, in the black wide-brushed letters on a white board, but this time it threatened that anyone who gets too close would contend with the sheriff. 18 hyperboloid cooling towers were set on the opposite side of the river in 2 daunting rows along the river. You can imagine these nuclear cooling towers that we see. There were 9 in a row and then another row of 9, and they just appeared as I rounded a corner. And there are no people, but these signs of people. Again, there was a chute, maybe as wide as this room, coming off of a giant pool of cooling water, pouring into the river, going downstream. An enormous nuclear plant sprawled out behind to the west. An oversized pool of water poured into the river. The puzzle now made more sense, and I was grateful for the instructional signs. Stay away from the nuclear plant, the cooling towers, and the under-river discharge, or you'll be in trouble with the sheriff. I'm not sure what happened that caused the signage, but something may have happened to a previous paddler. But nobody put a sign up about the radioactive water or about the dead fish from the spill. And if whoever put the 2 signs up didn't put the signs up, I wouldn't have any idea about any of it. So the imbalance of power and information and safety was real apparent up there. And this is the Excel Energy and Enbridge, who I think they're the same. I'm not sure, but they work together in getting the fuel and getting us electricity and power. But my heart just broke because, again, like here in La Crosse with the African American community and the dominant community, and how it's so easy to disregard people. And to plop this down without really discussing it or having permission. The indigenous people up there did create a second route for the piping, but they didn't want to do that, the company. So this is there to stay, and they've had 2 spills since last November. And you can't really ever learn about that unless you really Google and find it, because they don't want you to know, and they don't really care if you know. And that's very distressing to me. As I went down the river, I didn't see a lot of people, but I could tell the disparity and inequity in different ways. And this next piece is about that. This first one is a short reading from my chapter called Memory. And it was after I got home and realized I have way more memories about this trip than I thought. And they just kept coming and coming, and this one came. And then the next set is on the same stretch of river just after this episode, but is from a different chapter. So I'll read them, but they do connect. So I said the ride was smooth and river edges were not far from center. As I write it, I feel a strong sense of peacefulness and gratitude. I feel as though I am back there right now, as I was writing this at home. It was so exact and an excellent day as I braided downstream, without much wind or interference, following the turbulence of flooding, storms, and getting lost. On this stretch, large homes were set back on groomed lawns, pitched slantwise toward the river and flood-proofed. These landowners had the resources to reclaim and claim their riparian rights with upright docks, stone walls, fresh riprap, and confidence. The landscapes met the wall edges neatly, and the patio or deck space was well kept, with comfy furniture above water level and shielded from rain and wind. I never did see a person, but once I heard a lawnmower in the distance. And I say that because I saw many, many large rural or river homes and no people. And where you took me, Shai, on a camp in Iowa, there were all those campers. When you dropped me off, I thought, wow, there's so many people. But there were no people, because these are all second homes to people who have other homes. And they only come to these homes occasionally, but they have the resources to maintain more than one home. And that's not bad or illegal. That's not my point. But the next part of the river says this. A few days later, it was beautiful and peaceful when I paddled the river toward Crow Wing. I kayaked 45 miles that day and met up with only 2 people, a couple in a fishing boat who spoke to me with interest. Otherwise, it was a wild and isolated place. On the shoreline, there were occasional well-maintained summer homes with no people, which I just read about. Eventually, the nature of the dwellings transformed into small villages of aged RVs and rusty campers, old school buses and shacks used for permanent housing. Some are caving under the constant moisture of river humidity. Excuse me a minute. I passed several of these villages, and the only signs of life were a man exiting a pit toilet, so no plumbing, and 4 indigenous children laughing and playing on a muddy, broken, tilted trampoline. And these little villages were in areas right at the riverbank that still had trees, ungroomed trees that made everything shady so there was no grass and everything was mud. Where these other homes had, I'm pretty sure, cut down all the trees and made very large, expansive lawns they kept groomed. It was very colorful, where in this other location, which was maybe a mile downriver, it was very dark and gloomy. I passed several of these. The difference between the well-maintained and spacious homes in these collapsing, overcrowded communities was harsh on these same miles of river. I was paddling for hope, for a change of hearts in all people to embrace that we are all worthy, whether well-resourced or not. I was kayaking through another great divide with my book about boundlessness and abundance. My heart was getting heavier. I didn't write about this other part, but this reminds me of Cairo, Illinois, which is further down the river. And it used to be a town of 15,000 people, including a very healthy Black population that included businesses and churches and schools. And now today that town has about 1,700 people, and they are asking people to come and please buy the homes for $500, $800, whatever, just come, because it's a ghost town. And it's a ghost town because they engaged in lynching and murder and brutality against their Black neighbors over the last century. And it's a city, or it was a city at the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers. It had everything it needed. It's built a huge levee with big gates to keep water out. They're flood-proofed, and they couldn't get over their hatred, and now they're gone. Many are dead. And so these two types of housing and living qualities on the river up north, to me, is no different. I'm sure the people downriver who had the beautiful homes were aware of the people downriver with the muddy, filthy, broken down homes. But they were indigenous people, so who cared? Maybe they cared, but what did they do? They did nothing. And that just sickens me, and it didn't leave me through the whole river, because we have to, on purpose, ignore it. And we have to, on purpose, live next to it and know about it, but make it not important. There are other places along the river with different groups of people, some white people, but not as empowered, but mostly people of color who have been stomped on and marginalized. Down by Baton Rouge, there's a strip of, well, it's about 200 miles long. It's a shipping lane called the Chemical Alley, because there's so much factory and loading of barges. There's a yellow powder on the water. And what used to be there were Black communities that had built homes and businesses in those riverfronts. But these corporations wanted that space, so they just built their stuff right in front of it and pushed them back. So that's their front yard now. And I don't want to go on too long, but I think you understand what I'm saying, that we hear about these things, but our own Mississippi River is full of it. And if I didn't ride the river and see it from back in the river channel, I wouldn't know about it like I do. So that's a painful memory for me, and I'm sure for all of us. I was going to read about the diversion channel at Aiken, and I think I'll just tell you about it. And it's not about, well, it is about people, but if you can imagine the Snaky River up there, like 3 miles of Snaky River is about a mile on land. And sometimes you can see I want to be over there, but I have to snake for 3 miles, which could be an hour and a half, and I just want to lift my boat up and walk over there. But that's how snaky it was, and beautiful too. But there was this one place where it snaked into this beautiful U, and there's a town at the bottom named Aiken. And I was told it's not Atkin or Aitken, although it's spelled like that, but they call it Aiken. And the people there are real tight, like they belong to this Aiken thing and this little bottom. So they decided to, what I call, give the river a lobotomy. And they built a channel across the top of the U. It's a 6 1/4 mile straight channel. And it has a low head dam. So when the water of the Mississippi rises a certain height, it all pours into this channel and cuts across and joins the river over there. And it does that because otherwise it would flood and go down and flood their town. And of course, who wants that? That's not a bad thing that the Army Corps did. I think they did it in the 50s or 60s, and it works really well. But I had a chance to either go straight or go over the little dam and take this, or go down the U. But it looks so cold and so unnatural, this thing that cut into the land for all these miles. But it served a good purpose. But I knew the people in that town are all white. And that's my point. Nobody told me that, and I didn't see many of them, but I know that's what it was. And if it was an indigenous town or a Black town or a Hispanic town, I don't know that they'd get the funding or the interest to build this, and they'd have to deal with this flooding. And it's just a typical thing. Everybody knows about the diversion channel, and it's a good thing. It's like our Pamel Creek. But I feel like we have to think. We have to think, does everybody have a chair in the room? And so that I'm not going to read, but that's something that, it struck me about everything. I couldn't get out of my mind the heartbreak of separating these people from these, and you people get to have this and do this and not look over here. And that is just so striking, down alleys, through the river. So the last thing I wanted to read is when I landed down above Dubuque, and I was ill, so I had to come home. And I say that because that's the truth. But inside I was like, oh gosh, I get to go home. I couldn't wait to get home, because by then I was really lonely, and the river is really big. And I learned how small I was, and how no matter how smart I thought I was or able or how calm the water was, I was never going to win over this river. And but I was ill, and I contacted my family, and we found something on satellite where they could drive in and meet me on the riverbank, but I'd have to paddle up a couple hours. And I was okay with that because I knew I was going home, and I didn't want to leave too soon. I wanted you guys to get there before me. So I sat on my campsite. It was on a big a dredge island of sand, and it came in, and then it had a rise. So I was sitting on that, having coffee. And next to me, I wrote in a different chapter about the loosestrife. And this is referring to that, but it was a big loosestrife plant that came up beside me, and I wanted to lean on it, but obviously couldn't, but I was leaning in it, and I could feel it in my hair. And I heard this noise and felt a vibration, and I looked at it, and it was full of bees, which was okay. I mean, I wasn't afraid of the bees, but they were so busy because, you know, loosestrife has the tall spikes with hundreds of little tiny flowers. They had a lot of work to do. And obviously they flew across the river to get to it because I was on an island, and I knew they'd load up and they'd have to get back heavy. But I was jealous. I felt this jealousy because they had each other. They were a group. They all knew what to do. They all knew how to do it. They all came, and they didn't get mad at each other. They didn't steal. They were just doing their work. And then across the way was another island covered with pelicans. Not quite up yet for the day, but kind of wandering and sitting. And I was upset about it because they had each other. But they had a spirit together. They had a knowledge of each other, and they had fairness. And I just felt the brokenness of the river and the people, and then of myself. And so this is what I wrote just before I went home. Our species need constant positive and personal interactions with other humans, and we need to know that the bond is assured. When mutual kindness is the bedrock that we nurture, but only with chosen others, it does not entirely provide so that we can fully flourish. Most know how to contribute and protect and give, but not often to anyone but their own. Like the loosestrife bees and the pelican flocks that come together for the common good, these are human functions beyond just the wild and creature world. Broadening skills and beliefs of acceptance outward and toward others could come easy if we wanted to confront our discomfort. For those we do not know or recognize, or who look different, who choose outside our ordinary or show unfamiliar manners or dialect, with those who have different experiences now and before, we still share our same human need to belong. But when close-hearted, it is very much slighting our own instinct, which, you know, the animals would. You see all the bees, nobody's slighting each other. But if they did, they'd have to go against what they were programmed to do. And humans do that. Paddling on the river for this hope was difficult for me on many days, but all the same, it was my chosen action to recognize our potential for love, for open hearts, and the mutual need to belong wherever we live, to come together in a place of home. When I wrote that, I was thinking about having just moved. I grew up across the river, so I came to La Crosse a lot growing up. I lived in Vernon County, so I came to La Crosse a lot. But I'd only moved here 3 years ago to live in La Crosse. But I was coming home, and it felt like I was coming home to my neighbors, to my home, my house, and to La Crosse. But I wondered about the Black community here, who have been here longer maybe than me, and some are new. I know you've been here since forever. Do they feel this is their home? And do they feel that they are at home in their community, inside our home? And I pondered that, and I don't have any answers because I've not talked to anybody about it, but it's on my mind, what we call home, how we feel belonging, and how essential it is. And if I withhold that from you because I don't like you, or because I have more power or money than you, I'm withholding something that is given longer than birth, forever amongst us. It's inside of us like bees fly. We need to belong. And we can make anybody feel like they belong anywhere. And I never felt like I belonged on the river. I too was shunned and made separate and ignored. And it was okay because I didn't need anybody. I had a phone and I had a SOS button that called the right people when I did need them. But if I needed a fisherman, I couldn't rely on that. So people choose not to act on the belonging urge. And so these things are in my book. But it's not all this heavy. I can't stop thinking, and I wrote it all down. So I hope that you'll read my book. I've read it so many times I don't even know if it's good. But it's fun. I had a lot of fun doing it, and I think it's interesting. I'm interested in it. I learned a lot. So I welcome you to borrow it, buy it, or just find it. We're going to an independent publisher so that the independent bookstores can buy it and have it, like Pearl. But again, it's called The Truth on Water. And I'd love to hear if you agree or not that I've called out truth, even about animals and water itself. So that's my story today, and I thank you for having me. We're going to have questions here? Okay.